Well, I think the biggest challenge in covering hurricane season in Houston is that when you say Houston, you have to ask yourself, are you talking about Houston, the city, or are you talking about Houston, the overall area of Southeast Texas? Either one of those is enormous, and it has its own challenges. Not only do you have folks that are generally down at the coast, like Galveston, for example, folks in Chambers County down towards Matagorda, which may have a more direct impact from things like storm surge, for example. You have the other fact, if you're talking about Houston as an urban area, just the amount of concrete and pavement itself produces its own difficulty with the amount of rain that falls. And obviously rain doesn't necessarily soak into concrete. We got a lot of it around here in Houston, and that's where the flooding concerns usually pick up. So that's kind of what we look at when we try to figure out what's the main issue with forecasting for Houston in terms of hurricane season, is which of the biggest threats are going to hit certain areas the most.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the biggest challenges is trying to get it right and getting that uncertainty conveyed so that people can make the decisions they need to make. It's always a difficult process to not only convey the forecast in a way that people understand it and react to it in a way that you want them to react to it, to take it seriously and make the preparations they need to make, especially for a big event like a flood or a hurricane or something like that. And also nowadays, to some degree, rise above the noise. There's a lot of noise out there in the forecasting world, and there's a lot of misinformation in the forecasting world with social media and stuff like that. And so it's making sure that the folks of this region are getting the trusted information that they need to make the decisions they need to make.
Yeah, great question. Because there's such an influx of folks that come into the greater Houston area, some that may have never lived in a hurricane-prone area like the Gulf Coast here, I think the biggest thing is to always make sure that you're prepared ahead of the season. Last thing you want to do is be fighting people at the grocery store or at the hardware store for things that everyone is trying to get at the same time. It's a big headache. It's a lot of hassle. So if you can go ahead and get it ahead of time, that's probably the best thing. A couple of things to put in your sort of hurricane preparedness. The number one thing I could always tell you is to have a way to get some type of power, whether that's a crank, battery-powered radio that also has some outlets for your phones. That's a great way. Medications are super important as well, not only just for you, but for your pets and the rest of your family. And then another thing is to make sure that you have provisions enough for being without power for more than a week. A lot of times these storms come in, they smash through pretty fast, but just like what happened with Hurricane Ike back in 2008, it took an enormous amount of a power hit, and there were folks who were without power for weeks. So things like pallets of water, things like making sure you've got non-perishables. Putting all that information together and getting it ahead of time before we get into the summertime will really alleviate a lot of the headache if and when a storm comes.
Yeah, so the first thing is you have to have a plan. And that's easy for me to sit here and say. And you can sit there and shake your head, yep, I got a plan. But you really have to have a plan. And you have to practice that plan. You have to kind of write that plan down. And a plan, saying, I'm going to leave my house and I'm going to drive to Waco and stay with a friend. That's a plan, but have you let your friend know that you're planning to come up there when the hurricane's coming? Or what if your friend is out of town? And just go through all of that this time of year before there's a storm in the Gulf of Mexico. Now's the time to kind of go through that plan. And based on your plan, you have to have a kit. And so your kit's different if you're in a coastal area and you could potentially be asked to evacuate because of the storm surge, you're going to be asked to leave. That's a kit you need to take with you to take wherever you're going to go, versus a kit where if you're inland, you're going to be sheltering in place and staying put. That's a different kit. You don't necessarily need 5 and 10 gallons of water if you're going to get on the road and travel to San Antonio, versus if you're going to stay at home and you need 1 gallon per person per day in the aftermath of the storm. And the other thing to keep in mind about these kits is that, there's a lot of lists out there and a lot of information of what you can put into your kit. You have to build your hurricane kit for you and for your family. So if you have pets, somebody else might not have pets. You need pet food and the stuff that goes along with that. If you have kids, it's a good idea to bring some stuff for the kids to do. It's not necessarily survival stuff. It's crayons and coloring books, because their iPad and phone may not work. And so that, it's the medications for you, not the general medications, not the Advil or the Tylenol or the Band-Aids, everybody needs that. But it's the medication specific for you that you may need when you're out of this area. And then the other thing to keep in mind is you get into hurricane season, flood insurance. Only 30% of the residents in Harris County have flood insurance. And it takes 30 days for flood insurance to go into effect. Policies are not issued when there's a storm in the Gulf of Mexico. And homeowners insurance does not cover flood. And so it's very, very important that everybody here, not just in Harris County, but everybody have flood insurance. And I hear all the time, well, I'm not in a floodplain. I've never been in a floodplain. I've never flooded. I didn't flood in Harvey. Okay, but 60%, historically, 60% of the homes that flood in our area do not flood from a creek or a bayou, which is what the floodplains are from. They actually flood from the roadway systems being overwhelmed. And those are not in a map floodplain. You're not required to have flood insurance. You're not in a floodplain. Nobody's sitting there telling you should get flood insurance. But 60% historically of those homes are in those areas. And so that's why we encourage everybody to have flood insurance. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard, oh, I've never flooded before, and then they flood it. And, people flooded in Tropical Storm Imelda in 2019 that didn't flood in Harvey. 2 years before in the northeast part of Harris County. And so it's really important to have that. And the difference of trying to put your life back together financially between having and not having flood insurance is significant. If you just look at Harvey, for example, the average payout for a flood insurance claim was about $120,000. So that's somebody who had flood insurance, filed a claim, they got about $120,000. For those folks who did not have flood insurance but got assistance from FEMA through the disaster declaration, the average payout was between $4,000 and $8,000. So try to imagine trying to put your house back together with only $4,000 or $8,000. And that's why it's really important for the financial security to make sure you have flood insurance.
The biggest thing is that Houston is extremely unpredictable in terms of its weather. It's sort of a misnomer that everybody thinks because we're down here on the third coast here in the Gulf Coast that, it's just hot and humid all the time and it rains in the summer. Yeah, that's true, but there's a lot of microclimates that are within the greater southeast coastline that continue to wreak havoc on forecasting overall. Anything from the potential for big thunderstorm clusters that start way off in West Texas that can migrate all the way through the night and come smashing through here that didn't even start here. That's one of the hazards we run into sometimes. How a place can get 16 inches of rain in one spot and only get an inch in less than about 20 miles. So the geography itself is an enormous difficulty in terms of figure what the forecast is. And honestly, one of the biggest factors of all is this fella right here. The Gulf of Mexico. We live just above the world's biggest bathtub 24/7, 365 days a year. An unlimited amount of moisture that can do a whole lot of damage in a very little bit of time.
I think the biggest is our ability here to come together in the face of tremendous challenges. And I mean tremendous challenges. When you start talking about Harvey, even the winter storm, to come together and as a region recover and overcome those challenges. And that's a long-winded way of saying it's the Texas way of we don't necessarily wait for help sometimes from the federal government. Or from others, we do what needs to be done when it needs to be done. If you look back to Harvey and the utilization of civilian boats to go out and rescue people because the emergency side of things was just completely overwhelmed. But it's not that we went out and asked for people to get in their boat. They were already doing it. They were already out there rescuing their neighbors and taking them to where they needed to go. And then just the generosity and the outpouring typically after disasters. But I think we all understand that we kind of live in this area, and it's just not Houston and Harris County. You see the same thing down at Rockport and Port Aransas, where Harvey was a devastating Category 4 hurricane, of people coming together to help and put their lives back together, and not necessarily relying on funds and resources from the federal government. We take care of ourselves. We take care of our own. It's kind of a Texas thing, putting that in kind of a nice way. You don't always see that in other places. I've been to a lot of disaster areas across the nation, especially hurricane disasters. And there is that degree of helping after a storm comes through and everything like that, I think everywhere. But it's a little bit different here in Texas. People pull out their barbecue pits, they cook food, they bring, people into their homes, sometimes total strangers into their homes. And it's just that helping spirit we have here, kind of that Texas spirit, if you will.
I 1000% agree with Jeff. I think that's the number one thing, is that, the community of Houston understands that this is a shared experience. You may not, let's use Harvey. In Harvey, some areas may have only gotten 2 inches of rain. Other places like Kingwood got close to 2 feet, right? So the people in Kingwood needed a lot of help. So people around the area that were like, hey, I did okay. I have the resources to be able to help. I've got pallets of water. I've got this and that, whatever. I'm going to go and I'm going to help my neighbor. Because if you've lived here long enough, maybe back during Tropical Storm Allison, you got that 2 feet of rain, and somebody over in Kingwood, for example, went to help you. And I feel like that's the shared experience that everybody has as a greater Houstonian and as a Southeast Coast resident, is that you grow up knowing that there will be opportunities that someone will be in need and you can help them, because when it's your turn to be in need, they'll help you. And I feel like that's something really specific and special to Hurricane Alley and everybody that lives down in the Southeast and in the Gulf Coast here, because we've all got our war stories from different storms. And, we wear them as a badge of honor, because part of that war story is not just getting through the storm, as scary as it was, or the damage that happened to your house, but it was your neighbor coming to help you, or you coming to help your neighbor when they needed it. This is one of the biggest melting pot cities in the entire country. And I think we all take a lot of pride in that. And part of being a melting pot is understanding that when someone needs help, you help them out. And that's just not a Houston thing. I think that's a Texas thing. And you do for your neighbor because they do for you. And it's interesting, because people across the country sometimes, I heard this one time, people will say, oh gosh, I feel so bad for them, so poor them. We're like, no, we're good. We'll be all right. We'll get through it. We got water up to here, but we'll be all right. It'll eventually go down. Right? And that's just part of that Texas spirit, to just say, well, okay, let's get through it.
I think the biggest thing is and I say this again, is to have a plan. And you say, well, okay, I have a plan, but I have a plan for everything. It's not just a hurricane. It's not just a flood. The winter storm, for example, a lot of the same things you do for a hurricane, you could also have done for the winter storm. It's the same impacts. The power was out, the water was down, cell phone service went down. It's going to be the same thing we have after a hurricane, except the temperature is going to be a lot different. And so you can utilize a lot of these same plans. It's the same thing we saw when the pandemic started. Back about this time last year, we started running out of certain products at the grocery stores and stuff like that. And if you kind of have that stuff stocked all the time at your house in preparation for disaster, you already kind of have that. And then also getting trusted information, I think, is really big, and being careful that you're a steward of not spreading rumors and misinformation. And I think that's important, because in this day and age, rumors and misinformation can spread very quickly, and it can be taken as fact very easily. And we've seen some of that in some of the past storms we've dealt with. And so I think it's very important to verify you're getting your information from trusted resources, from trusted sources, your television media, the National Weather Service, the National Hurricane Center, emergency managers, elected officials. That's where you need to be getting your information from. If you're getting it from so-and-so on social media, I'd be a little bit wary about it, and I definitely try to verify it. And before you hit share or tweet it out, verify it, because that just continues that spread sometimes of the misinformation. And it's not just before the storm and during the storm, but it's also after the storm. When we start talking about resources available for recovery. And, you know, somebody's giving away $1,000 in this parking lot today. You know, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And so just be cautious of sharing that information and getting that information from trusted sources. And that's something you can do personally at your level and your community level. And then another great thing that we learned about really during Harvey was Nextdoor. And that's the app that allows neighborhoods to kind of communicate on a very local scale, you know, the neighborhood level. And one thing that we learned was, you know, neighbors helping neighbors at the street level. You know, hey, I have gas for a generator at my house at the end of this cul-de-sac, and you know the neighbor down at the stop sign needs some gas for the generator. That's great. It's what can you do on your street, and can you organize, you know, some help on your street. And the other thing you can get involved in is called Cert, the Community Emergency Response Teams, and you can go to their website at Harris County OEM. ReadyHarris.org is the website. You can go to there and click on Cert, and you can get involved with what you can do as just a normal resident and citizen during an emergency to help your neighbors in a more unified and processed way than just, oh, hey, here I am.
The trick with hurricanes is to figure out where they're coming, where they're landing, how long they're going to stay, and what to do about it. If you're farthest toward the coast, you need to get out because you've got a wind problem as well as a water problem. If you're around the Houston area, normally you're in a zone where you're supposed to hunker down. Don't clog up the roads because you're probably okay. And then further north, the hurricane is going to dissipate as it comes in. The other thing to think about is exactly where it is. If it is to the east of us, then chances are, like Rita ended up being, we're going to get the dry side of the hurricane. The wind is blowing from the land as it swirls. It's not carrying water onto us. If you get the hurricane coming in on the left side of us, we get all the dirty side, all the water. This happened for Ike. It happened way back at Carmen, a little bit for Alicia. Everybody will remember these. Now, the one that's different is Harvey, because Harvey had a problem. Harvey wasn't a big hurricane, and no one was really worried about Harvey. After all, it wasn't even barely a 4 hurricane. It just wasn't that big a deal. But you had to look, and you started listening to weather people who were kind of hedging their bets, and you thought, maybe there's something wrong. Then you looked at a map that showed the high pressure, and there were 2 big high pressure cells in the United States. A hurricane is low pressure. And the result of that is that the low pressure can't go through the high pressure. So Harvey couldn't leave. He showed up one day, and it was still here 4 days later. And the whole time it was here, it was raining. So it really wasn't the wind. It really wasn't the speed of the wind. It was the water and the water and the water. And we got like 51 inches of water in one place. That's, you know, huge. But it gave us a brand new variable we hadn't faced before, and that was how long the hurricane hangs in. If a hurricane is a 4 or a 5, but it goes whoosh right on through, we'll be okay probably water-wise. It won't, I can't say we'll always be okay, but we're much better off than if it hangs around. It's turned out that just a 1 or a 2 hurricane that doesn't leave is far worse for us because we flood easily than one that moves fast through the Houston area. Now, I've got some videos to look at, and we can see how they explain hurricanes. So let me get that set up. Start it moving. And you see the patterns of the water. And you see we get the swirls as the hurricane comes off of Africa and comes in somewhere, usually in the tropics, and it is already has this rotating motion to it because of the way the Earth rotates as well. And the question is, how strong is the middle of that system? And that depends to a lot of extent on the temperature. Here in wintertime, we're not that hot. But look what happens in August. The Gulf gets extremely hot. The heat is energy for the hurricane. It's what feeds the hurricane, the heat of the water. One of the most interesting hurricanes was over 100 years ago, the 1900 hurricane in Galveston. And it really illustrates how far we've come and where we started. The Galveston hurricane of 1900 trapped so many people on the island, and they couldn't get off. We had one causeway to get off the island, which we almost do now, but it wasn't very fortified, and people didn't leave early. And so they had to hunker down, and they were on an island that flooded with water. And so you can imagine what a problem it was. And we lost, the rumor, 4,000 to 6,000 people died on this hurricane because people could not get out. They couldn't get away from the water. And more importantly, it was Labor Day weekend. They didn't take it seriously because they just didn't know they were supposed to. And the weather people just missed it. And they didn't have the data we have now to know the hurricane was coming. If you look at the pictures afterward, you'll see this was Edison's first camera coming down, his first video. They didn't even have the video. 1900 was a long time ago when it comes to mobilizing people, when it comes to knowing the weather, when it comes to satellites, and even video cameras. So it's a fascinating hurricane to study because it does show how important it is to be prepared and to know what's coming. So what did we do with Galveston? We built a seawall, and that seawall held out the water. And it really made a huge difference. Well, probably the most important thing was realizing that the seawall was very, very important. It doesn't cover the far ends of Galveston, but it does cover the central part of the city. The storm surge is real. And when they say a storm surge of many feet, it's many feet of water. And water is, if you think about it, it's pretty dense. Water can really push you. If you've ever been in a high tide, ever felt the water move, water is very powerful, and a hurricane can move a lot of water. Also, a problem we have in Galveston is beach erosion, and this is quite serious. And we are spending a lot of time and a lot of effort in how do we hold on to our beaches, because when a hurricane brings a lot of water in, it takes a lot of sand out. And that is another strong consideration. What can we build? If you look at the seawall, it doesn't go away. But West End, where you've got all that land and you have those houses so close to the edge of the beach, it really becomes another question we have to solve as part of hurricane preparation. And Galveston is doing a lot of work on this. They're making artificial oyster reefs and real ones and doing a lot of work in that area. What will hold on to the sand? Go to Galveston, go to the West End, and notice how they have bridges going across a lot of what looks like scrubby land with a lot of plants just hanging on. That's very important. Those are the plants that will hold on to the sand. So hurricanes are important. They're not the panic that people should always make. Remember, if you're inland, if you're living on Galveston, you know better. If you're really inland, just be patient with it all. Now, if you flooded for Harvey, or you can find out the land you own did, then you need to think about flooding. Chances are you're okay if you're high enough, if you can check on your land to see if it flooded or not, if you can rebuild your house a little higher. Houston is not a bad place. Now, what's changed over the years is all of the building. Back when everything was fields to the west of us, those fields absorbed a lot of water, moved the water down through the water table and not across the land. Concrete doesn't do that. And to the credit of our construction people and the law, we make people make retention ponds in their subdivisions. We say you can't cover more than a certain amount of your land with concrete, because concrete will not drain. And that's what you want the most, is the water not to go in the bayou, not to go rushing down downtown Houston, but to go in our Braze Bayou especially, but to go down into the land. And it can't do that with concrete.